You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contrast. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
For a limited time at McDonald's, get a Big Mac extra value meal for $8. That means 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, and medium fries, and a drink. We may need to change that jingle.
Prices and participation may vary.
He tipped his black hat to the enormous crowd. There's no place like New York, the president said as he walked arm in arm with Mayor Edson of that city. Cannons firing, chimes sounding. Hundreds of thousands of people have come out, lining the streets for the opening of a technological marvel, the Brooklyn Bridge, Suspension Bridge across the East River. A river has been conquered. Bedazzling electronic light lined this marvel as President Chester Arthur and dignitaries made their way across. But the real sight was not the lights on, but when the lights were turned off the bridge and fireworks erupted from barges on the river. This is a time when New York City's fortunes was tied up with America's fortunes. It always has been, but in a much greater way, a much greater percentage of the population lived right here. And the president had been a resident of this city as well. And let us speak politics. This empire state, New York, was bread and butter of stalwart GOP politics at this time in the Gilded Age. It could go either way between the various GOP factions, and it could go either way between Republicans and Democrats, and often determine elections. So any visit to New York City, especially by a president who came from there, had political edges. This appearance did this president no harm. Because although he had arrived at this office by a tragic incident, and no one more aware of it than he had his eye that perhaps he could be the first vice president to succeed a president to get 4 more years on his own. It was grand. Throngs lined the streets to glimpse the actual person who was president. Few knew that while this was going on, it was exhausting this very man. Arthur would spend 5 days after this event in a hotel, resting before he could return to the nation's capital. A couple of reporters took note that upon his return, he went right to the soldiers' home for more rest. Some even said he was showing up with his old custom house hours, 11 a.m. in the morning, sometimes noon. They saw laziness. One reporter said a shadow of repose has come over the White House. But haters gonna hate. The visage of that carriage, the trotting about the Capitol. Ornamentally sculpted fabric and leather, green with red relief. The president's magnificently tailored, his lamb chop hair unmistakable, and his smile, as one said, a veritable Chesterfield. The White House now being redecorated by Tiffany and Company, and the president's hired a new French chef. Let us consult William Seal's excellent The President's House. Shortly after becoming president, Arthur purchases an English quarter-pattern landau. This is a carriage where there's a definite almost a room on it where the rider sits in. Lacquered in green and red with his coat of arms painted on the door in gilt. The coach lamps were silver-plated. The interior was fitted with gold lace curtains, and the same lace trimmed the throw pillows on the tufted seats. Practically everything was monogrammed CAA in gold thread. It was a sweet ride. The parties held by this new president and his sister, who acted as First Lady, were exceptional. And yes, Arthur does wait 6 months where he's in mourning for James Abraham Garfield, the president who was shot before he took office. And that means he's wearing black during that time. That means when he writes letters, his stationery will be ringed with a black line, the stationery of mourning. But after that, Arthur does what he does well. This man is a New York socialite. He knows how to give a good party. All his ambition, said Mrs. James G. Blaine, seems to center in the social aspect of the situation. Flowers, wine, and food, and slow pacing with a lady on his arm, and a quotation from Dickens make up his book of life. Arthur was always on the move, and he was naturally the center of attention wherever he was. From Washington, he traveled to many parts of the country, both in the private cars the railroad lines kept at his disposal and in the Navy ship, the USS Despatch, which functioned as a presidential yacht. He hunted, he fished, and he posed for the photographers. His clothes were tailored in New York, his suits for every occasion. At luncheon, he wore a cutaway, at dinner always a tux, unless he was giving a larger dinner party, where he wore full dress. He never left town without his personal employee, Alec, as Arthur called him, a sort of valet and a confidential assistant. Alec Powell was African American. And in the summer in 1884, when a newspaper described him as a servant, Powell responded that he was in fact a messenger. I hope in the next edition of your paper you will correct the same. Chef Cuplinger also traveled with the president. He cooked and kept supplies of wines and spirits. He bought silver, linen, and china from the White House for use in the president's railroad car. He was unsurpassed in his art, and being very talkative, he was often sought out by reporters to get quotes. We'll talk about a quote that comes later that's not so helpful to the president. Parties, receptions, says a Philadelphian who comes to visit the White House and had been there during Hayes's administration. Parties were more extravagant than ever known in Washington. The season was King Arthur's. And so, with his sister, Mrs. McElroy, who becomes an excellent social bon vivant of sorts, and with Arthur, a new image. Nowadays we have a phrase, soft power, that there could be a power that's unseen and just being able to charm people, being able to bring people together. Finally, a president who could visit the summer mansions of Newport, Rhode Island, and not stick out like a sore thumb, actually fit in, not miss a beat at those state dinners. I don't like pop references, culture references. I don't like TV references. But just to help, if there are people who have watched that Gilded Age TV show, this is exactly what we're talking about. And I won't belabor it because it's not important if you haven't watched it. But I just want to say that that describes the time period where these social niceties and presentation is so important for fitting in and being able to achieve what you want. And Arthur is actually depicted in that HBO TV show. He appears top hat and coat, the #1 visitor at the sensational wedding of Alice Blaine, the daughter of Secretary of State, or former Secretary of State, James Blaine. Chester smiled, shook hands, congratulated Mrs. Blaine. Blaine knew, as Arthur was congratulating his daughter and eating cake, that Arthur was his rival for the presidency, and fate had put into the office a man who actually knew how to move the levers of power, to order, as the newspaper called it, the Mikes and the Jerrys of the Empire States, the average people who did all the political work about town. as they sipped champagne and pleasantries at Blaine's D.C. mansion. Blaine, by the way, resigns as Secretary of State. Arthur asks him to stay on after James Garfield dies. And Blaine stays on only till December and then resigns. Arthur does replace him. Blaine does not leave the city. Some tell him, go back to Maine, go back to Augusta, enjoy life, get out of politics. Blaine does not. He has no intention of doing so. He has a mansion in DuPont Circle, and by God, that's where the family's going to live. As far as he's concerned, Chester Arthur is just a placeholder. In fact, at one point, he points back to Chester Arthur with his thumb, a bunch of people note, and he says, there is no way that man is going to be nominated. The word gets back to Arthur, but Arthur will not break his Chesterfield smile. Blaine had actually considered staying in Arthur's cabinet. He didn't know quite what to do. I really do believe that the shooting of James Garfield, where Blaine was right next to him in the train station, really affected Blaine a lot. Not just politically, but if you look politically, it really did kind of narrow the scope of what he could do. Blaine really thought that he was going to dominate the Republican Party now with his having the ear of President Garfield in such a strong fashion. And all those hopes for naught, and now here is Arthur as president. One by one, each of Garfield's appointees to major cabinets that weren't stalwarts, that weren't people nominated to placate, Conkling and Arthur, they leave. The Attorney General, when Arthur tried to get him to stay, he simply didn't believe Arthur. He was a half-breed. You're a stalwart. Don't change the rules. That's not the way this works. I don't think you're really interested in the Department of Justice. Already within weeks, he had been tested. Arthur was a Conkling stalwart, and so when James Blaine resigned, it was, many thought, a simple matter. He's going to put his old buddy Roscoe Conkling into that position. Isn't Conkling his great mentor, his great advisor? But it's not what happens. And indeed, Arthur has at least one other advisor, and it's a fellow we haven't talked about except in episode 1, the former Governor Edwin Morgan of New York, a very powerful figure, just like Conkling in New York. And he seeks out Morgan's advice, and Morgan's giving him advice, saying you really can't appoint Conkling to the position, and perhaps Arthur already knew this. And so Conkling goes down, he has a visit with the president, and to hear from Conkling's mistress, Kate Sprague Chase, the two were having a long affair, a long time with the senator, to hear from her, because she does end up writing a letter to Arthur, Conkling's devastated by this meeting. He's devastated by not getting this Secretary of State position that he feels he's earned. He looked so sorrowful. He comes home empty-handed. It goes to a stalwart, Frelinghuysen. He's a capable man. He gets praise from the press. Maybe Chet is different here. No, most newspapers say Chet is a spoilsman. Good God, Chet Arthur is president. He's one that wants this system, putting employees in office for their loyalty to party, not country, and assessing them. That taxes business, that taxes the people, that makes things more expensive. He's taking over in the wake of Garfield's death. Even when they see what happens with Conkling, they're a little surprised, but they also say, well, he's not going to be that obvious about it. He can't put in Conkling. Said Whitelaw Reid, Arthur is entitled to respect unless he forfeits it. High praise, but also tentative. There was always something hanging over Arthur during his presidency. More reassuring were business leaders in the country. They knew Arthur from the Custom House, yet talked to the New York stalwarts, the Conkling men, the Arthur men. They expect more. They're getting nary a job. They're talking about Arthur's good friend Tom Murphy. Didn't he help get him in there? And what does he get? Nothing. Empty-handed. No jobs for him. In fact, Arthur keeps most of the Blaine men in their positions. Some even say, this is not Chet. This is the president. Even Ulysses S. Grant is a bit disappointed when Arthur picks someone else than his choice for the Secretary of the Navy. Mark Twain will say, I am but one of 50 millions, but in the opinion of this 1/50th million of the population, you could do no worse than Chester Arthur's administration. Twain is a fair weather complimenter. But check with the rest of the American people first. Chester Arthur sets his sight on something else: the Harbor and Rivers Bill. Now, this is a large congressional spending package that, guess what, has, in some cases, little to do with harbors or rivers. It is essentially that so much revenue has been collected by the federal government in tariffs that they are able to appropriate different projects. And yeah, some of them are for clearing rivers and things like that. But basically, it's a congressman's dish where they can find things for their district that federal spending's needed. And today we'd call this term pork, right? Of course, everybody's view of that is different. Every congressman thinks that they don't spend any pork money, but it's a lot of money. And the main point is that it's gone up over time, and it seems to be in connection to the amount of revenue that comes into the government. They, in a sense, find a way to spend it. Its magnitude's higher than it was in 1870, and it's even multiples higher than it was when Chester Arthur was nominated for vice president in 1880. Chester Arthur vetoes the bill and says, come back with a less spending and I will sign the bill. Now, for the most part, he's applauded in newspapers for this. And it's actually not something that gets him in trouble with the stalwarts. Roscoe Conkling actually hated this Harbor and Rivers bill as well. They liked offices and putting people in offices. All this extra spending was a little different. It benefited greatly the South and some parts of the West, and this is why it passed Congress, because a coalition of Southern Democrats and Republican Westerners wanted this spending and was able to get the bill passed. He's saluted, particularly in Eastern papers, particularly by these business people, and he gets a letter from Julia Sand. Julia Sand is a woman living in New York City who had written to the president before, and we know that he read her letters, urging him to do something, to do more, to do things for the benefit of the country, and she salutes him. It touches my heart, she says, when you do something for the good of the country. The Harbor and Rivers Bill is quickly overridden over Chester Arthur's veto. He'll get some props. There is, I believe it's the New York Times that says they should have listened to their wise executive. Congress should have listened to their wise executive. Congress is woefully unpopular for passing this Harbor and Rivers Bill by the public. This from the National Republican, August 4th, 1882. The president has done his part to protect the public treasury, and he deserves and will receive the hearty thanks of the country. It required independence, nerve, and broad statesmanship to veto the river and harbor steal. The New Haven Journal and Courier. President Arthur never made his qualifications for the high place he occupies more apparent than in his veto of the River and Harbor Bill. In a Democratic newspaper, the veto is the theme of talk today. The first effect was to make congressmen very angry. Most of the Southern and Western members felt indignant and expressed their indignation in vigorous and picturesque terms. Even such a moderate man as Randolph Tucker says he thinks the veto will be unpopular throughout the South. Some of the aggrieved members have discovered that President Arthur has yielded to all the powerful railroad influence. Their claim is that the railroad interest has become alarmed at efforts to improve the waterways of the country and thus interfere with their monopolies. But it puts into Chester Arthur's mind something they hadn't thought of when he took the reins, and that's that if he can't cut down the specific bill, he's got to find a way to cut down the amount of revenue going into the federal government that's causing this big surplus that's making congressmen greedy in his point of view. And he's also mad that his veto was overridden. I mean, it doesn't look good, even though he gets some couple of applauds in newspapers. And so he's going to decide to tackle an issue related to this that Republicans in the 19th century hadn't really addressed before, and that's the tariff. He's going to set his sights on the tariff. More about that. People are taking note of his sensible administration. People are taking note of the soft power that he has. A lot of times on this podcast, and you may have heard it referred to, that in the early going, say the first half of the 19th century, really going all the way till after the Civil War, D.C. is not a very good-looking place. It's not a very majestic nation's capital. There are all kinds of comments from diplomats from around the world that are like, I got to go to Copenhagen, and now I got to go to Washington, D.C. It's muddy. It's infested. No, now, in the 1880s, D.C.'s the reverse. A lot of spending has gone. It'll turn out to be a lot of corruption behind that spending, but put that aside. There's a lot of spending that has gone into the nation's capital. Paved streets. It has all the grids that L'Enfant might have wanted at the beginning of the century. It's the pride of the country. Crowds are visiting. There's more people living there than ever before. Here's from Carp's Washington. These Washington streets are the finest in the country, broad and smooth, made of black asphaltum, as hard as stone. They are kept clean as your parlor floor. The street cleaner is a character whom you will seldom find out of Washington. He rides a great machine whose roller is covered with hundreds of stiff little twigs arranged in a spiral. As the horses pull the machine along, the roller turns, and the broom-like twigs sweep the dust and dirt off to the side, where they are gathered up and carted away. Washington has the most reasonable streetcar system in the United States. 2-cent, 3-cent, and 5-cent fares. I know of any other place where you can get about more easily. There are hundreds of horse cars, and the transfer system is such that you can go all over the city for one fare, or the farthest for two. So you have a good time in America. You have a president who has this soft power image. The Boston Globe, 1881. He is fashionably dressed, trousers tight-fitting and coat cut short. The glossiness of his silk hat is rivaled only by the reflection from his highly polished shoes. The rather brilliant colors of his necktie and size and profusion of his jewelry, but otherwise he would pass inspection so far as clothing is concerned anywhere. It occurs to some that this presidential image could be used for very good cause: the protection of a national treasure. It's Philip Sheridan, the general, the hero of Shenandoah, who suggests to Chester Arthur to visit an area called Yellowstone. Often disregarded at this point, though it is a national park. In fact, settlers and ranchers seem to be encroaching on this property. And if they're not stopped, if there's not some national feeling towards this place, they just might succeed. And so the president goes. On the evening of August 4th, 1883, the presidential train arrives at Cheyenne, Wyoming. And the President, Secretary Lincoln, and Senator Vest said a few words of greeting. By the way, Secretary Lincoln is the only member of Garfield's cabinet to stay on, and that is Robert Lincoln, the president's son, who's serving as Garfield and then Arthur's war secretary. The party reached Green River the following morning and spent the remainder of the Sunday relaxing aboard the train. 3 mule-drawn spring wagons took the party to the banks of the Sweetwater. During the last 45 miles of the trip, the president moved outside next to the driver. Local chiefs called on the president, and shortly some 500 warriors staged a sham battle for his pleasure. Arthur was then presented a pony for his daughter, a war dance followed, and the festivities were concluded with an exhibition drill by troops from the 5th Cavalry. Then the party started out on horseback, the escort and pack mules following northwest into the Wind River Valley. For the next 3 weeks, Arthur and his companions enjoyed the sparkling air, the clear streams, and the magnificent scenery of the Yellowstone country. The Continental Divide was crossed 3 times, and camp was set up at once at a point 9,000 feet above sea level. They rode until afternoon and then camped behind a stream, hiking, hunting, and fishing for the remainder of the day. Arthur proved to be an able horseman and retained his reputation as a skilled fisherman. On the 23rd, at the edge of National Park, he and Vest caught 105 pounds of fish. The young newspaper columnist Eugene Field soon published a playful poem in which a frustrated Shoshone chief vowed to move farther west to escape presidents who threatened to spoil the local fishing. The end of this 350-mile march was reached in August 31st, where the party arrived at the Park Hotel at Mammoth Hot Springs. The president was in high spirits. One reporter quoted him as calling the journey better than anything I had tried before. The trip coincides with visits to Kentucky, with visits to Chicago, with a couple train stops along the way, with the Chicago Daily News devoting 15 columns to letters received from distinguished men in all sections of the nation evaluating the conduct of the administration. Henry Ward Beecher writes, "In my opinion, President Arthur has proved himself to be a safe man in the administration of government, prudent in counsel. There are some people, and particularly Democratic papers, who are going to criticize the expense of this trip, or that this Yellowstone trip is some type of a distraction to get away from things that are going on in the Capitol. They mention that there is a Supreme Court justice that wants to see Arthur that cannot because he's out west." Things like this. Other papers, more on the Republican side, are talking about how fascinating that we have a president that can go out and see the people, and that a president would take an interest in the western part of the nation. This message is brought to you by Vanguard. Vanguard is investor-owned, which means the clients own the funds that own Vanguard. As a result, Vanguard makes every decision with your interests in mind. The bond market is complex. No single person can realistically track every sector, maturity, and geography. That's where Vanguard's scale makes the difference. With a global team and decades of experience, they can spot and act on opportunities that others might miss. If you're an expert in the bond market, that's great, but for most of us, we are not. So we're looking for someone to partner with. Vanguard could be, for you, that organization. While some managers promise big returns that come with big risk, Vanguard takes a different path. They don't go all in on risky bets. Instead, they focus on reliability and consistency. It's not always a flashy strategy, but it sets the standard for what dependable investing should look like. To learn more, go see the record for yourself at vanguard.com/audio. That's vanguard.com/AUDIO. All investing is subject to risk. Not all his trips during his presidency went so smashingly well. By the 1880s, Florida vacations for well-to-do Northerners had become a common and maybe fashionable thing, aided by both train and steamship. But for Arthur, this trip, aimed at relaxation, was anything but. As he went from train to steamboat with his Navy secretary and his valet, he reluctantly came also with 4 reporters. The humidity and the crowds really started to get to him. Just the trip down, just getting to Florida at all, was hot and dusty. Even in Georgia, reporters find Arthur's French chef, who came along for the ride and for cooking, and found him covered in dust, admitting to a reporter, "This is a dreadful trip. I have put on 3 shirts this day." In Jacksonville, 3 infantry units came to visit the POTUS, including a Florida African-American brigade. Well enough. And at another stop, he's presented with an actual eagle. But subsequent St. Johns River trips exhaust him. He's trying to sleep in a small area in the steamboat, finding it impossible. Reporters jot down that the normal, happy president is irritable. In Orlando, he gets a break for fishing. But it's believed that he catches malaria, which is not helping his already tired condition, and will not be good for his health, generally. He's nearly excited to leave Florida, and when he gets to the city of Savannah there, he joins a party. It's a more social occasion. He has some fun. He eats some shrimp salad. There's likely some wine. And whether it was the hot sun or the shrimp or whatever it is, on the steamboat from Savannah, he screams in pain at 2 a.m. and summons the ship's physician. There he tells the ship's doctor, "Few friends know this, doctor, but I have a functional disease and my kidneys attack me." The illness, though not the specific one, makes the New York Times. This is one of history's many cover-ups of a presidential sickness, but it does reach the newspaper because reporters are there and they heard the scream. But that ship's doctor merely describes the president's problems as indigestion. Now, people are starting to see things. Some people in Chicago, when the president goes on his Yellowstone tour, say that this is not the same guy we saw in 1880. The last time we saw him, this is how things worked in the 19th century, right? You don't have TV and video. Last time we saw him in Chicago was 1880 when we nominated him for vice president, and he looked more vibrant. Now he's looking a little pale. Arthur had Bright's disease. And there really wasn't the drugs to treat this. There were probably some palliative measures that could be undertaken. It's not an uncommon condition at this time. In fact, it'll be revealed later, not now, that James Blaine has it as well. It's not all fun being president. It's not all moving around and seeing people, the kind of things that Arthur likes. Again and again, he's tested. This is a politician that came from the old New York stalwart faction, and now he's in an office where he is in a position to nominate people and he can give certain gifts to people. But yet, again and again, there's that question. Should he? Should he? And he feels that he inherited an office from Garfield and has to act accordingly. And so when it comes to one of the biggest jobs in the federal government, a man named William Robertson has his former job at the New York Custom House. And the call from the stalwart says, "You're a new president. You're a new president. You should be removing him from office." And Arthur will not do it. I'm going to read from one of my favorite little books, William Hudson, Recollections of an Old Political Reporter, because he goes right to this. "I was on terms of confidential intimacy with John O'Brien, a famous Republican district leader in the New York of that day. Having had a hint of the quarrel between the two men, I sought O'Brien for information." The two men he's talking to at Conkling, Roscoe Conkling and Arthur. O'Brien was a shrewd, keen-witted Irishman of great common sense who had converted by tact and ability a strong Democratic district on the east side into a Republican stronghold. He was a man on whose judgment in all matters political Arthur greatly relied. When Hudson asks O'Brien, "Is there a quarrel between Arthur and Conkling right now?" "There's been a quarrel, all right, and I don't see why I shouldn't have tell you what I know, but the break is a bad one, and it's not going to be healed up. The president's right. He isn't Chet Arthur anymore. He is the president." Chet was greatly shocked by the assassination, and while Garfield lay wounded, Chet got right out of the political fight. Said it wasn't decent for him. He might be called upon at any time to be president. He can't be found in a factional quarrel. Is that what Conkling was mad at? Hudson asks O'Brien. No. When Garfield did die and Arthur went to the White House, he was greatly sobered by the immense responsibility. He said to me the American people would never have chosen him if it had been thought he would reach the presidency. And so it was for him to show that he was worthy. The only way was for him to be the president of the whole people and nobody's servant. And Hudson asks O'Brien, well, is that what got Conkling mad? Chet doesn't say much about it, but he's very bitter over the demand made on him, and he doesn't like to talk about it. But you put it down for a fact that Conk wanted Chet to remove Robertson and appoint one of our fellows collector. Impossible, Hudson says. I'm not saying that Chet says so, but I'm guessing close enough to be right. What Chet says is that the demand was outrageous, and told Conk what he thought of it, and Conk got mad because Chet did. Anyhow, we're all of us in the soup, and Conk has got us out swearing that all his friends have turned traitor on him. So, there you have it. Hudson reporting what Jim O'Brien said. Jim O'Brien's a reliable source. I have to say this book comes years later, but it does make a lot of sense that, in other words, everything that we're going to talk about, the steps that Arthur takes, it's not really what angers Conkling. It's this one position that he kept the port collector in that's more helpful to James Blaine and the half-breed side. Indeed, how we know that Conkling is mad, that Chester Arthur does eventually nominate Roscoe Conkling to the Supreme Court. And he's building up all this credit, and people think he's sensible, and he's not just looking out for the stalwart faction. And then when that Supreme Court opening comes up, he gives it to Roscoe Conkling. And the Senate actually approves it. And then what Conkling does is refuse it. And no one knows why, but we suspect it was to kind of turn the knife in. Conkling is no longer a significant leader. As we talked about in the last episode, he lost his Senate seat. He refuses to help the Republican Party in the 1884 election. The way some people will tell the story is the next time you hear from Conkling is in 1888, he goes out in the famous New York City blizzard and is lost in the snow. Sometimes you hear it told that way. He never is lost in the snow. He's able to find his house, but he goes for a walk in the middle of the blizzard. He refuses the streetcar. Soon after that, Conkling dies. The Weekly Transcript and Messenger. Chester A. Arthur, preaching civil service reform, is a spectacle to make celestial angels laugh and fallen ones weep. Chester, me boy, be ye in earnest. Mr. Arthur says some very good things about the crack British system, which it's clear he doesn't like, but is afraid to abuse in its prosperity and popularity. He is certainly right when he intimates that no strictly competitive examination will fill all the positions with the very men needed in them. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about civil service reform, which is the signature achievement of Arthur's administration, it's not really wholly his achievement. And as you can see in this letter from the Transcript and Messenger, at first, in his first message to Congress, he expresses a desire for civil service reform. I mean, he has to. There's an outcry over the killing of Garfield, and allegedly that this was done in the name of getting political jobs, even though Guiteau was a crazy man who had no chance of getting any political job from anyone. He was just nuts. But put that aside. The public wanted some action, so what Arthur does is say that he'd support it, some type of reform. But he feels that if you subject everyone to examinations, rigorous examinations like the British do, the British have a unmarveled civil service that is completely separate from the political part of the government, the parliament. It does have to do what the parliament tells it to do, but within that is a lot of rules and regulations, and shame goes to politicians who try to influence the British civil service too much, although it does happen. This is what many want for the American system back in the 19th century. what Arthur says, if you do that, you're just not going to have enough people for all the jobs that you need to fill. Whether that's true or not, it's real difficult to say. He's going to change his tune over the course of a year. But it's not because of any influence on him. It's not because of Garfield. It's not because he's taken a stand or sticking it to the New York stalwarts and Conkling and all of that. It's because the Republicans lose an election, and they lose big, and Democrats are able to take over the House. And so they'll have the House in the next Congress. And everyone that's coming in is going to be for civil service reform. So the idea is the president issues he can beat them because Congresses don't sit immediately in January. So tail end of 1882, he issues a special message in which he supports civil service reform. And he says, it's the bill of the type that had been proposed previously. Well, George Pendleton, a congressman from Ohio and a Democrat, had submitted a civil service bill that protected tens of thousands of jobs. And he submitted this 2 years ago, and absolutely nothing was done with it. And Arthur, as vice president, didn't do anything with it. This was a member of the opposition at the time. So Pendleton submits it again, and this time it's known that Arthur will lend the bill his support. So what they are doing, in effect, is beating the new Congress before it can come in and craft legislation that is probably stronger. Now, it's strong. It's definitely a radical change for the United States of America, but there still are some limitations to it. The number of jobs affected are limited. Does not apply, for instance, to all those postmasterships. The entire Civil Service Commission is set up by the president. It's administered by the president. The president enforces it. As one newspaper commenter correctly said, it supposes a friendly president. So it's legislation that could be stronger. You could, for instance, put congressional checks in there, and that might be what that Congress coming in wants. But what Arthur and supporting Pendleton's legislation agree on is not to do those things. So in a way, it's giving a little before something worse, in effect, happens. Here's Matthew Josephson in Politicos. This is a book from the 1930s, and he's writing a bit with a Depression-era perspective. There had been in America a jealous libertarian defense of the individual, the citizens, and against a permanent bureaucracy. You see? So it's all well and good when we talk about civil service reform like it's a guaranteed good, but there was another side to American politics. There still is. There's this kind of libertarian streak. Like, we don't want to create this big government. If you think this isn't a live issue now, and, as I'm recording this, it certainly is. It certainly is. You don't want to create a distant bureaucracy. But what Josephson notes, in its wake, an invisible game was played. Bureaucracy went to the parties. You see, you took it away for the Jacksonians, took it away from the government. So we're not going to have a permanent bureaucracy in D.C. People regulating us that aren't us. Every time we get in, we're going to appoint our people. To the victor goes the spoils. But what ended up happening was the bureaucracy then goes to the parties. And both Democrats and Republicans have people on the ready to put into jobs and systems in place and people that are going to decide who gets the jobs when that party gets into power. And it's almost the same thing. And so instead of having a professional bureaucracy, you have two parties mainly with bureaucracies. In the end, patronage politics had gone to such extremes, especially in the moment of killing Garfield, that the cry for civil service reform was taken up by the whole nation. The leaders in both great parties delegated this house cleaning for years. And then the voice was felt in a landslide for votes for congressmen, mostly Democratic, in 1882. You also are going to have, we talked about it before, those Star Route cases it made not acting on civil service just impossible. Arthur signs it. Of course he signs it. If he had vetoed it, it would have been overridden. There were enough Republicans, enough reformers, and almost all the Democrats ready to vote for it, or they could wait for the next Congress. Ulysses S. Grant does not like what Arthur has done on civil service reform. And Julia Sand wrote Arthur. Now, this is a woman who lives in New York City who's been writing letters to the president since Garfield was shot. It is by our appearances that we will be judged. The presidency puts a man terribly to the test. If he has fine qualities, they will shine. If he does not, they will kill him. What has Grant been good for, except to eat dinners? Julia Sand asked. Will Hayes be remembered for anything except a Sunday school festival? You hear so often that Arthur was influenced by Julia Sand and her letters. You'll even have people like ascribing to her this whole civil service movement that Arthur changed because of letters like Sand. And I would go this far. Julia Sand letters, which there are many, and which we know Arthur read, at least from Julia Sand's account later, is that I would go this far, that she provided support for some things that in many cases Arthur was already going to do, but just one more supportive, well-written voice. He's so interested in these letters that he makes a surprise visit to the Sand house to her brother. We think that Julia Sand was an invalid that was confined indoors for whatever reason, but obviously was reading newspapers, following politics, and writing letters. He makes a visit to the house. Now, the way things went then, he would have to visit the brother. And this comes at a time when Julia Sand says she's been writing all these letters to Arthur. She admonishing him on some things. She had just about given up on my dear friend. She had asked him to come visit her several times. He had not. And then appears at the door this Episcopal minister. That's referring to Arthur. That's what he looked like, she says. And yet she's so flabbergasted that now this man she's been writing to, the President of the United States, is on her porch, that she doesn't feel she had the proper time to really discuss things. But according to Sand, so Arthur obviously is going to take issues with some of the things that Sand has taken. So the idea that she's just telling Arthur all this advice and he's following her, I think has gone a little too far in some of the recent history books. But, and he wouldn't agree with things like Grant is better for nothing than eating dinners. He might agree about Hayes. For instance, Julia Sand will say that he delayed the Star Route trial, and Arthur's not going to agree with things like that. So he did discuss with her points in her letters that he disagreed with, and other points he agreed with. When Arthur becomes president, he doesn't have any direct role in the trial of his predecessor's assassin, Charles Guiteau, but it nonetheless hangs over his presidency and is in the news constantly. Most Americans want him dead. There was a fear that Guiteau might get off of the charges. He's charged for murder once Garfield dies, as some famous English assassins had, on a charge of insanity. In fact, representing him in court, he says, his defense says, that God made him do the act, and he was not therefore in control of his actions. I mean, the American people so hated Guiteau right now that one of the U.S. Army guards operating under William Sherman fires a rifle at the assassin and just misses his head in the prison cell. He was disgusted that among his duties he had to guard this man. He was punished, and William Sherman had to assert that though he also hated Guiteau, the law must prevail in this country. More embarrassing to the president, he's pleading through his brother and his sister. His brother is annoyed, of course, with his younger brother and thinks he's crazy but doesn't want to see him die. And they're pleading for President Arthur to now intervene. In one letter that his brother tries to get to Arthur, he says, "I made you, President Arthur. You have to help me." President Arthur's only role in this is to wisely decide not to take the visit of Guiteau's brother at all and not accept any messages, though Chester Arthur does take time to listen to two experts on insanity, and after consulting with them, the White House decided it would not intervene. There would be no pardon. Guiteau is hanged. Now, most people accept he's a crazy man, but you've also got the Star Route trials. So I think these two trials, the Guiteau trial and the Star Route trial, hang over Arthur's presidency and kind of box in what he was ever going to be able to do here. What is the Star Route trials? It's not something we hear about a lot today. The old postal route system allowed for bidding, so people would bid to deliver the mails, especially in the western states. And what would happen is there was this clause that said, well, sometimes, the expenses might be over the bid and they might have to charge a little more. What ends up happening is a system in which U.S. postal officials in the post office are, in the main post office in D.C., working as Assistant Postmaster General, is implicated in a scheme to sell off some of these routes, and then people would bill excessively. We'll see one here. Here's from Matthew Josephson, the Politicos. One of the first and most painful duties that devolved upon the stalwart party manager, now elevated to the White House, was the prosecution of the Star Route ring, inherited from Garfield's term. What made it more difficult was that Stephen Dorsey, the field marshal of the National Republican Committee in 1880. So this is the guy running the whole national campaign that Arthur is the VP candidate on. He had been eulogized by Arthur at a public testimonial banquet. No, he didn't die. It just means he made positive remarks about him. Other members of this ring was Brady, the second Assistant Postmaster General, who collaborated in many a political battle with Arthur. The confession of one of the members, M.C. Rudell, the private secretary to Dorsey, in June 1881, had shown how large the conspiracy had been in fraudulent postal contracts, rivaled only by the whiskey frauds under Grant. So the whiskey frauds were again where federal government members were extorting various manufacturers of whiskey and pocketing money for themselves. And the American people had it, and it was part of the stain on Grant's administration. And then here, the problem with the Star Route case is the biggest problem is that it showed that it still continues. Even Hayes, even Garfield, people who seem very different from Grant and less corruptible, maybe themselves, but they're either tolerating or not aware of the corruption that was going on and the scope of it, the amount of these postal routes that were being sold. They all underwent trial in February 1882, pleading not guilty. They were defiant and indignant. Tremendous legal obstacles to proper indictment in the District of Columbia were raised, partly through the advice of Roscoe Conkling. So Roscoe Conkling, the former senator, is going to be their lawyer in some of these cases, or at least their advisor. The actual lawyer, Robert Ingersoll, made emotional pleas for the defendant. Constant attacks were made on the judge in the press, on the grand jury, and on the prosecution. Confessions by ring members were recanted. Government witnesses became undependable, hard to locate. The jury fails to agree after a trial of many months. This is a stain on Arthur. Julius Sand, who has been writing letters to Arthur, and we know that he's been reading them. This young woman says something to the effect, she's not always very kind to Chester Arthur in her letters. She says something to the effect, "You must have known of this. You must have known of this." But Arthur is nothing but supportive of this trial. In fact, in September 1882, there's a new trial order, and 9 months later, following a process that was a little more than a succession of mob scenes, appeals to patriotism, denunciation of rebels, the intimidation of the state's witnesses. In other words, what they constantly say is, this is just another battle for the stalwarts, this Starroot case. And every time they're attacked, they make it political. Boy, that has nothing to do with today's politics, right? Mixing legal and politics. Here's Josephson again. A jury brought in a verdict of not guilty as indicted. We are led to conclude with a historian of Arthur's term that the president and his official family could not find it in their hearts to do more than a modicum of duty towards their own partners. How can the leopard change his spots, or professional stalwart politicians prosecute their former colleagues in more than a half-hearted matter? Nevertheless, the open stealing from the till of government was sharply reduced after these famous Starroot trials. The officialdom of the party separated itself from large-scale revenue frauds. Only an overzealousness on the part of certain officers sometimes showed itself. So, Josephson is suggesting that Arthur or the people he appointed may have had a light hand on this prosecution. We won't know. What we do know, his official actions as president, he appoints a prosecutor who he believes is going to go after them. He even tries to keep Garfield's attorney general in that office who would prosecute this case, and he refuses to stay. But nonetheless, what you have to think about is this hangs over all the actions Arthur takes. So when you're going to see things like civil service reform or appointments that he makes, Starroot is a big factor. The public is outraged about this, and they're especially outraged that the people get off. Now, Josephson talks about that William Chandler, who's the Secretary of the Navy, not the one that Grant wanted to appoint, but Arthur's choice. Very capable one. But he does cause some stir in the manner by which he awarded large shipbuilding contracts to John Roach, who had been a patron of the Republican Party campaign. But in the matter of the Roach shipyard contracts, the system of patronage had become already both more refined and more restricted than before. Businessmen, Josephson said, had grounds for satisfaction in the improvement in our tax-gathering institution brought during Arthur's term. We should point out that one of the things Arthur will accomplish, even though there were some questions about the contract and who it was awarded to, there'll be a lot of fighting about that after Arthur's term. Arthur, many will say, is the father of the steel navy in the United States, and he sees that cruisers with steel plating are built. Here's Reeves. Arthur surprised many reformers by administering the Pendleton Act efficiently and effectively. In early May, he adopted the civil service rules proposed by the commission, making only slight modifications. For the remainder of its tenure, the administration at all levels evidenced a willingness to abide by the principles of reform. But reformers were wary of the administration's sincerity towards this reform. They had objected strongly in December when a stalwart was nominated to be commissioner of the District of Columbia Civil Service Reform Commission. But Arthur does withdraw this nomination after criticism. As we alluded to earlier, Arthur had been upset by the veto of the Harbor and Rivers Bill, and had decided to act on the source of money for that. He can't keep vetoing every spending legislation and they're just going to override him. So let's address why the government has too much money and Congress is spending it. And so he calls for a way to reduce the surplus, and that means to reduce tariffs, taxes on imports, for the relief of industry and enterprise from the pressure of necessary taxation. And he names 9 individuals to form a commission to look at the tariff. Here's what Thomas Reeve writes. Republicans had traditionally favored high tariffs, arguing that they promoted national economic self-sufficiency and encouraged prosperity for both business and labor. Democrats had come out for lower tariffs. They contended that excessive protection favored manufacturing over agriculture, fostered monopolies, and increased prices. There were divisions in both parties on the issue, however. Several Republican congressmen, particularly from the Midwest, were committed to rate reductions. Members of the reform wing of the GOP, influential far beyond their number, used their newspapers and magazines to call repeatedly for moderate but meaningful decreases. An average of about 40 Democrats in the House of Representatives, on the other hand, were staunch protectionists, like most of the Republicans, and prevented serious tariff revision for more than a decade. True free trade at this time is practiced only by a handful of theorists, but they are growing in number. So, Arthur argues for a commission. The Congress passes a bill, has a commission on tariffs. He appoints members. Here's what Reeves writes. It was the president's responsibility to nominate members of the commission. And he was not long without advice. The names of 200 applicants reportedly poured into the White House. John L. Hayes was named to head the commission. Well, here's the problem. Hayes is the head of the wool manufacturers, a well-known lobbyist against tariff reduction. He's going to head this commission. Arthur tries to name a very, good government guy, former Vice President William Wheeler, Vice President under Hayes, to be the vice chair of the commission, but he won't accept. 4 of the men on this committee of 9 people were personally or officially connected with protected industries, heavily protected industries. Now, from the executive mansion, Arthur calls for the abolition of all excise taxes, except those on distilled liquors. He recommends the repeal of numerous custom duties that yielded small returns. He urged Congress to simplify complex schedules of duties, particularly those of cotton, iron, and steel. He goes further in his recommendations than people expected, but what you have to understand is this is an area of expertise for Chester Arthur. He was the head of the custom. He was the guy collecting at the Port of New York, the biggest collector in the country. And he knows that while some business people, industrialists in these industries might like him, there are attacks on other business people. Now, as far as Arthur gets is really the creation of this commission. There's a line from Benjamin Harrison who says, the creation of the Tariff Commission was a confession that tariff needs reform. Republicans got beat in the 1882 elections. They didn't want to get beat again. They knew that tariffs were an issue that could be welded against them because of their connection to how big the Treasury was in Washington. People didn't like seeing those numbers. And the committee that he appoints actually proposes reductions. It could be reductions as much as 20%. This could have been a significant achievement. But what ends up happening is Congress takes the presidential commission and says, thank you very much, rips it up, and passes their own bill. Now, John Hayes, who had been the head of the wool manufacturers, who had been heading this commission, he leaves the post of the committee where he recommended to cut things by 20%, and then gets back to the wool manufacturers and starts advocating Congress to, indeed, rip up that suggestion and come up with your own bill. The resulting tariff bill that Arthur signs has a couple of reductions in it, but not anything significant. After struggling for weeks, the Republican-controlled Congress produced a law that reduced duties on the average of only 1.4%. Its many awkward compromises prompted critics to label it the mongrel tariff. Iron and steel manufacturers thought, we're in a position of danger. Why are you even bringing up tariffs and adjusting them? In fact, John Sherman will actually say that the 1883 tariff bill, meaningless as it is, produced agitation for years to come over tariffs. Here's Thomas Reeves. In early 1884, Arthur was virtually a president without a party. Each of the GOP's warring factions found him objectionable. Half-breeds, those supporters of James Blaine, were of course implacable opponents of the president. Very few stalwarts might be counted on to back their former leader. A second Arthur administration would merely preside over the continuation of the little that they got, their ill fortune that they got under him. In fact, Ulysses S. Grant does not come out for Chester Arthur. He comes out for Illinois Senator John Logan in late March. Grant would describe the Arthur administration as ad interim, one that had fewer positively hearty friends than any, except Hayes possibly. Even worse, Tom Platt, who had been Arthur's friend through all of these episodes, notable stalwart, at Conkling's side, running for the Senate seats, right, and resigning together. He declares for James Blaine. And even though Roscoe Conkling is struck speechless by Platt's decision, he's seeing where the power's going. What you kind of see in 1884 is an interesting study in politics of what happens. We're always hoping for that person that's just going to do the right thing, right? But what is the right thing in politics? There's some obvious things. You had to do some kind of reform, and he did it, right? But other choices are more of magnitude, you know? So, for instance, independents don't really trust Arthur. They don't. I mean, Carl Schurz said, he's not really pleasing reformers here. He's not doing anything massive. He's still placating some of the bosses. In fact, he's sitting between two chairs. That's what he says. He's sitting between two chairs and falling into the middle. And several people will say things like this. The way that's sometimes told in the quick textbook history is like Arthur converted and then became a reformer. The reformers who are around in 1884 do not agree with that statement. They think merely that Arthur made a few head fakes towards them because of the way that he got the presidency. Nonetheless, James Blaine now is a pretty strong contender, but Arthur is holding the executive mansion. There are a number of people who want to work hard for him. An assistant postmaster stops by to visit Arthur and talks about activities he's going to do. He's going to start working on the convention presence. Arthur tells him, please tell your friends to stop your activities regarding my reelection. Chandler, who's a very important official, Chandler, offers to run the convention for him. Now, that's a heavyweight in terms of 1884 in the Republican Party. Running your convention effort. Going to go up against this forceful contender, James Blaine. Arthur refuses Chandler's offer to run. Now you have General Powell of Arkansas, an Arthur supporter or delegate to the convention, who does a deal that's a little shady, but kind of normal for this time. He asks the administration for a cabinet post in exchange for many convention delegates. Arthur refuses, and Powell switches over to Blaine. Everybody watching this is wondering, what's going on. Someone, a businessman in New York, sends a $100,000 contribution to fully fund Arthur's reelection effort, and he has it sent back. It's a very different time from 1882 when a New York senator, half-breed, Chauncey Depew, said, it's going to be between Blaine and Arthur, and you got to give the lead to Arthur here. Arthur's been doing everything right. The press loves him. The businessmen love him. Public loves him. Odds are with Arthur. Blaine didn't hesitate to criticize Arthur's administration. One thing he's going to be very critical of is that during the few months he was Secretary of State, he was attempting to start this Latin American convention, a Pan-American conference, where nations of the various countries are going to appear, with a lot of emphasis on Peru and Chile. Actually, Walker Blaine, James Blaine's son, is a diplomat for Peru. That shows you how important he saw this nation. What is this all about? Well, first of all, it's an attempt to expand America as a world power and its influence. Why? Because with North and South America, it's thought, we can stand against Europe. But more than that, Blaine wants a United States that's going to look Pacific. Look at Hawaii. Look at various islands in the Pacific where there could be coaling stations for our steamships. An aggressive westward policy that doesn't stop at California. In fact, Blaine would like the Monroe Doctrine to be applied not only to the nations in the Americas, but the Pacific, for instance, Hawaii. When Frelinghuysen takes over for Blaine, with Arthur's consent, he cancels this conference. this Pan-American Conference isn't going to happen in 1882. In fact, it's not going to happen for 10 more years. All the time, Blaine is complaining about the cancellation, including like the snub that was done to these Latin American countries, including that, Arthur, you said that you'd follow Garfield's policy. This is clearly Garfield's policy. Something's going on here, but Arthur does allow a group of Republicans to support him at the convention. It's not like the A-team, but he allows a group. In fact, when they go out on the train from New York to Chicago, there's a big banner, Chester Arthur for President. And the train has a minor accident, and the banner is damaged. And of course, reporters are there to see it, and of course, it's reported on as something symbolic, right? He tells this assistant postmaster that wanted to help him at the convention in a big way, come back and see me after the convention. I'll talk to you. He says, I will accept if the party wants me for the standard bearer, I will accept it. But he doesn't do the normal 19th century things that you do, the things that Blaine will do in 1 millisecond, trading jobs for convention delegates. Arthur's weakness at the convention does something interesting. It makes the real battle in 1884 in Chicago between half-breeds and reformers, not half-breeds and stalwarts, but half-breeds and reformers. So we made it clear, half-breeds are not reformers, the James Blaine folks. They're friends to monopolies, railroads, industrialists. Blaine, Summers with Carnegie, acts as a lawyer for railroads and things like that. So now with the Arthur wing of the party weak, and a movement now develops for George Edmunds, a senator from Vermont who is a reformer, wants a stronger civil service bill. Support them, they need the convention chairman. Okay, this is how it works in the old times. You want to show your support at a convention by electing the chairman that you like and that will support your motions. And so the Reform delegates back John R. Lynch from Mississippi. He is African American, and they nominate him to be temporary chairman till they can elect a more permanent chairman. Who gets up to speak to nominate John Lynch? And that is Theodore Roosevelt. At this time, he's just an assembly member in New York. A newspaper man calls him active, nervous, gray-eyed young man from New York. He throws off his straw hat before he speaks on behalf of them. Well, something happens here. Roosevelt and his friend Senator Henry Cabot Lodge backing Lynch. Blaine decides to back for chairman that General Powell from Arkansas. The guy had just recently switched from Arthur to Blaine. He wants to kind of rub it in the nose of the Arthur people. The problem is, this guy's been their opponent, and some of the Blaine people, the half-breeds, don't like Powell Clayton. It's a silly move, and it alienates Blaine's own supporters. Between forceful argument and some breaks from the Blaine people, John R. Lynch becomes temporary chairman. So this is a fact, in case you don't know it, that at least for a very short period of a GOP convention in 1884, the man leading it, the man holding the gavel, was an African-American, John Lynch of Mississippi. John R. Lynch would also write some history books about the Reconstruction. So it's starting to look bad for Blaine. Not only this, he loses the chairman, the temporary vote, and then they appoint a permanent chairman, and it's not who Blaine wants. So then they're starting to get scared. We could win this nomination narrowly. So Blaine decides, we want to make a rule that delegates here, they must support the nominee leaving. They must pledge to support the nominee leaving the convention, or they must leave the grounds. It sounds right. You hear that a lot now, right? Will you support the nominee if someone else wins? But there are delegates, especially reformers, who do not want their freedom impinged. I want to be able to leave here and not support Blaine. And so this motion is defeated, and even bringing it up makes the Blaine people look bad. So here's the thing. Arthur seems to have weak support at the convention, but the Blaine people are not really having a good time either as the convention starts. With a little more chutzpah, force, energy, Arthur, I see it, would have been able to win this nomination. He too clumsily wanted to only be the standard bearer if it happened with the entire party throwing up their arms to him. And with a fierce competitor, that's not going to happen. But there's this last gasp where maybe it can. The reformers and the Arthur people meet in a Chicago hotel and say, look, you've got something going. You've won a few votes, you reformers, and we've got something here. Now, Arthur delegates pledged to Arthur are pledged to the president because he's president. We can't switch to George Edmunds. That's not going to happen. These are people from the South. These are loyal party men. They want jobs in the future. So they either got to support the president, which they'll never get blamed for, because even if Blaine beats Arthur, the Arthur men did actually what their job was the way the system works. They were loyal. So Blaine, would still give them jobs and things like that normally. They either have to support Arthur, or if they switch to anyone, they have to switch to the next possible president, James Blaine. They can't go with some kind of crazy reform. So they say, you Edmunds delegates, why don't you support us? Support President Arthur. We can come out of this nomination. So there was still a chance that Arthur, even despite not really trying, could get this nomination. And that chance was in that hotel. But unfortunately, the Edmunds folks say, no, we cannot support President Arthur. And so you see here that Arthur, although he was supporting reform in some ways, was not seen as credible still, even at the end of his presidency, by the reform groups in the GOP. Well, they fight it out. You do have John Logan running. You do have John Sherman running. There's a few favorite son candidates. There's Edmunds. When Blaine is called, there's a huge demonstration. Cheering for him from the New York delegation is William Robertson, that chief collector of the Port of New York that Arthur did not fire. That doesn't ingratiate him with Arthur at all. He's supporting Blaine. So is Tom Platt, as we referenced. He makes a speech for him. There's a ferocious speech for Blaine. See, the negative of Blaine throughout history is that he's corrupt, he takes railroad money, there's all these secret money-making things that he's doing. The positive side is that he fights for Republican causes. That's why they call him the Plumed Knight. Like, whenever there's a fight, he does that battle. He was there in Bleeding, Kansas. He was there at Garfield's side when he fell. And there's a huge demonstration. For Arthur, there's a lowly district attorney from New York who is barely heard in the convention, who's hissed at when he makes statements. He does try to make the point that, look at the enemies Arthur has. That's because he's making the right decision. Nobody's swayed by this logic. Read the vetoes, another supporter of Arthur says. You will find him correct. John R. Lynch speaks for Chester Arthur, the African-American from Mississippi. So does Pinchback of Louisiana. So these African-American delegates to the convention are speaking for the president. And the next morning, the voting begins. And Blaine leads 334.5 to 278. They're going to need 415 to win, though. Edmunds gets 93, Logan 63, Sherman 30. Arthur's showing in the first ballot isn't terrible, and it shows that a more vigorous contest at this convention, and maybe Arthur could have been viable, but not for a passive Arthur. In fact, John Logan, it was rumored, his 63 votes were going to soon go to Blaine. So you have 1, 2, 3 ballots, not much changes, and in the fourth ballot, Arthur loses 75 of those delegates to Blaine. And many of the other lesser candidates, their delegates go to Blaine. He gets over 500 delegates, wins the nomination. Arthur sends congratulations to him. He's not really upset, from what we can tell. In fact, we talked about that assistant postmaster man who came to visit Arthur and said, I want to work for you and everything. And Arthur said, come see me after the convention. I'll explain something to you. Well, he does that. And he tells this man, Frank Coger, I have Bright's disease. I don't know how much longer I am to live. It could be months. It could be years. This is why I asked you not to campaign on my behalf. So I think we have there, if his story is to be believed, I think we have there exactly what Arthur was doing. If the convention turned around and nominated him, that's their doing, and he would have accepted it. But he could not have, in good faith, knowing his health condition, vigorously campaigned for the presidency in the way 19th century people do. As it is, James Blaine is going to lose that election. It's a very close election. In fact, it comes down to maybe 600 votes in New York State turning one way or the other. There's many third-party candidates that are soaking up votes on both sides, but mostly on the Republican side. Grover Cleveland, because Blaine's nominated, Democrats decide to go with Grover Cleveland for that contrast, because Cleveland is seen as incorruptible. He's administered New York well, and he's put forth civil service in his state. There's every reason to believe Arthur could have won an 1884 election. I mean, it's not impossible. As it was, Blaine was, to many people, a repugnant candidate, and nearly wins New York, just barely loses it. Chester Arthur's presidency is never going to be looked at as one of the activist presidencies, certainly not like Reagan, FDR, not even McKinley. However, a presidency is much more than just the few items that make the history book. And I'll say it's about Arthur and how historians should possibly view his presidency. He's a little more than just a placeholder. A placeholder would just be doing everything Congress was. But in the actions he takes or tries to take, he is pushing the agenda, not just succumbing to it. And there's a couple of places where this happened. We referenced earlier about the Navy, and he will push to have several ships built. We talk about, in the past, about tariffs and how he wants to change what had been the fundamental policy of the Republican Party on tariffs. He's not successful in doing so. Thirdly, and what we haven't discussed, is he makes certain moves on foreign policy. And one is to develop more the relationship between the United States and what is then a kingdom in Hawaii. The other is negotiating attempted treaty with Britain to possibly have a canal going through Nicaragua. It's not successful, though. The Senate's going to later block that treaty. He also gets involved in the Congo, and it's the first time that the United States has been on such a world stage in recognizing an international country in the Congo that other nations may participate and trade with. And this is working with Belgium. Congress is a little suspicious of this. Some of the American people say that the United States shouldn't be involved in something like this, but it is something that Arthur pushes. Yes, he's one of those bearded presidents that exists in the later part of the 19th century, and I think always will be. But I would encourage to see him a little more as maybe a transformational figure. So what we'll do is take a look at his last message. This is December 1884, the last message. Since the close of your last session, the American people, in the exercise of their highest right of suffrage, have chosen their chief magistrate for the 4 years ensuing. He's talking about Grover Cleveland. When it is remembered that at no period in the country's history has the long political contest which customarily precedes the day of the national election been waged with greater fervor and intensity, it is a subject of general congratulation that after the controversy at the polls was over, Arthur says the public peace suffered no disturbance. He focuses on foreign relations, trade, finances, infrastructure. War has concluded. A U.S.-Chile Claims Commission was pending to compensate Americans harmed during the conflict. Ongoing conflict affected U.S. interests in Asia. The president criticized the new Chinese exclusion law for possibly violating prior treaty rights. This is something that even though he's forced to sign, he's really forced to sign because there are the votes to override it. Unfortunately, bigotry against Chinese Americans, particularly in the West, was so strong, both party platforms had something about excluding Chinese. It may be seriously questioned whether the statute passed at the last session does not violate the treaty rights of certain Chinese who left this country with return certificates. Why is this important? Why does he worry about the restrictions on immigration in the law that he signed and wants Congress to reconsider? It's because there's such a commercial opportunity. In fact, all of Arthur's policy that he's going to present. He wants a reciprocal treaty with Mexico where we lower tariffs. He wants relations with Japan. He wants good relations with China, is because, here he says, the recent purchase by citizens of the United States of a large trading fleet heretofore under the Chinese flag has considerably enhanced our commercial importance in the East, in view of the large number of vessels built or purchased by American citizens in other countries and exclusively employed in legitimate traffic between foreign ports. Under the recognized protection of our flag, it might well be to provide a uniform rule for their registration and documentation, so the bona fide property rights of our citizens therein shall be duly evidenced and properly guarded. Now, again and again, what Arthur notes is you have a problem with funding consulates. You're not providing enough money. The U.S., there's more countries that we have to have consular offices in than you're providing funding for. For Egypt, for example, your failure to fund the Cairo consulate disrupted our representation there, and always in the background is the possibility of commercial activities. He asked Congress for support to support the Statue of Liberty's pedestal. He seeks a 7-year extension of the reciprocity agreement with Hawaii. In Italy and Europe, pressure was growing to eliminate tariffs on foreign art. American artists feared exclusion from Europe because of tariffs. In Japan, treaty revisions, negotiations pending, U.S. would accept terms of compromise from Japan. And this is something that happens under Arthur's, it's not really his doing, but the International Meridian Conference happens. 25 nations agree to use the Greenwich Meridian for global timekeeping and longitude. A universal day shall begin at midnight on the initial meridian. I mean, that's a small thing. We don't think about like time zones and unifying time, but it's happening during this 1884. He urges Congress to work with maritime nations adopting rules for sea collisions. He says the U.S. was absent from an international convention on international copyright protections and should not have been. He urges Congress to act and repeal the use of silver coinage. He says 185 million silver dollars now exist. Only 40 million, or 22% of them, circulate. The mere existence of this fact furnishes a cogent argument for the repeal. Otherwise, silver is likely at no distant day to become our sole metallic standard. Here's an interesting suggestion. The Secretary of War submits the report of the Chief of Engineers as the practicability of protecting our important cities on the seaboard by fortifications and other defenses to repel modern methods of attack. The time has now come when such defenses can be prepared with confidence that they will not prove abortive. He recommends an expenditure of 60 million for the most important cities whose destruction or capture would be a national humiliation. Adequate defenses, inclusive of guns, may be made. A sum much less than a victorious enemy could levy as a contribution. Allusion has been made already to the circumstance that both as between different Indian tribes and as between the Indians and whites, the past year has been one of unbroken peace. In this circumstance, the President is glad to find justification for the policy of the government in its dealing with the Indian question, and confirmation of the views which were fully expressed in his first communication to the 47th Congress. The Secretary urges anew the enactment of a statute for the punishment of crimes committed on the Indian reservations and recommends the passage of the bill pending in the House of Representatives for the purchase of a tract of 18,000 square miles from the Sioux Reservation. Both of these measures worthy of approval. The preservations of forest on the public domain, the granting of government aid for popular education, the amendment of the federal constitution so as to make effective the disapproval by the President of particular items in appropriation bills, the enactment of statutes in regard to the filling of vacancies in the presidential office, and the determination of vexed questions respecting presidential inability are measures which may justly receive your serious consideration. See, Arthur is pushing. He might not always be successful, but he is advancing the discussion as president. Right there's several items. One is the line item veto, and that's going to be used by one president ever, Bill Clinton. After the Congress grants him the right, he uses it once, and the Supreme Court throws it out. Because there never was an amendment. Chester Arthur calls for an amendment for a line item veto, so the president can actually identify things. And then also for the enactment of statutes about what to do in the case of presidential inability. He's somebody who has had to deal with this. The time draws nigh when I am to retire from the public service. I cannot refrain from expressing to the members of the national legislature with whom I have been brought into personal and official intercourse my sincere appreciation for their unfailing courtesy and their harmonious cooperation. And to my fellow citizens generally, I acknowledge a deep sense of obligation for the support which they have accorded me in my administration of the executive department of this government. Chester A. Arthur. The end of his presidency does have some moments. He is able to pass legislation on the last day of his presidency to enact a pension for Ulysses S. Grant, who desperately needs the money. He is able to, and establishing an office for him. He dedicates the Washington Monument, which the work on it had been ended in the 1850s mostly because of a conspiracy theory by know-nothings that there were papal stones in it, and then the Civil War. And now here in 1885, at the end of 1884, it's dedicated, and Arthur is there for that dedication. Here's Thomas Reeves. After Cleveland was sworn in, he and Arthur returned to the White House and reviewed a procession containing 25,000 men. The ex-president then gave a luncheon for his successor. He had been quiet and dignified throughout the pomp and pageantry. He does appear at the ball that is being held for Grover Cleveland. The two chief executives stood at either end of a huge semicircle, shaking hands for over an hour with hundreds of well-wishers. He goes back to New York City and begins a law practice. A handsome suite was provided on the 4th floor of the Mutual Life building. A life-size painting of Grant hung behind Arthur's personal desk, and in the outer office were pictures of Edward Morgan and William Evarts. No picture of Conkling. He was soon receiving daily massage treatments, and physicians paid frequent visits. At times he felt stronger, but relapses were sudden and inevitable. He attended the funeral of his Secretary of State Frelinghuysen and his son Alan's graduation from Princeton in the spring of 1885. But in February, his health takes a sharp turn for the worse, and the press is made aware. It is November 1885 when Arthur tells his son Alan to bring an old Custom House friend, Jimmy Smith, to the Arthur home, to be secret about it. And he's asked by Arthur to destroy virtually all his personal and official papers. While Alan watched, 3 large garbage cans were filled repeatedly and their contents burned. Arthur had told a cabinet member during his stay in New London that there were many things in his political career he wished had been different. He sternly advised. November 17th, Arthur was found unconscious by his nurse, the victim of a cerebral hemorrhage. 5 a.m. the next morning, he was dead. Washington clothed itself in black and lowered its flags to half-mast. Executive departments closed and a cannon boomed at half-hour intervals. The New York Sun proclaimed, "It is not too much to say that he was one of the most successful and meritorious in our whole list of presidents." Elihu Root, Secretary of War, will say when in 1899 a statue of Chester Arthur is unveiled at New York's Madison Square Park, it's still there today. Surely no more lonely and pathetic figure was ever seen assuming the powers of government. He had no people behind him. No people behind him. Garfield, not he, was the people's choice. He had no party behind him, for the dominant faction of his party hated his name and were enraged by his motives. His own faction already knew that just the discharge of his duties would not accord with the ardent desires of their partisanship. He was alone. He was bowed down by the weight of fearful responsibility and crushed to the earth by the feeling, exaggerated but not unfounded, that he took up his heavy burden. Surrounded by dislike, suspicion, distrust, and condemnation, he was wise in statesmanship and firm and effective in administration. Good causes found in him a friend, and bad measures met an unyielding opponent. Thomas Reeves notes, and you can't get away from it, that if you go to the Madison Square Park, Chester Arthur is facing Roscoe Conkling. They're pretty far away. It's not like obvious, but if you walk across the park, you'll see directly across is Roscoe Conkling. I'll have to go visit that this summer. I'll end with maybe what were Chester Arthur's among his last words to his son Alan, who said that he told him, "Never go into politics. The price demanded of me for office had been far too high." I want to thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this 5-part series on Chester Arthur and the politics thereof. Thanks for listening. Here's what I like about our sponsor, All the Hacks Podcast. You hear all these business podcasts, and they're all telling you to do things. Start a business, buy a home, write this off, write that off. All the Hacks is a podcast that acknowledges that things are kind of expensive right now. So All the Hacks focuses on tips and tactics to upgrade your life, your money, your travel, while spending less. It's about hacks, money. There's an episode about what each generation gets right and wrong with Ben Carlson. No relation. Some of us in Gen Z or boomers can learn from millennials and Gen Z. It doesn't just go one way. I like his bonus episode about earning points on your mortgage or cards that have up to 4% bonus programs. All great. Search for All the Hacks. That's All the Hacks in your podcast app. Hit follow and start upgrading your life today.